The frontier was built on blood and justice. Subscribe and relive the untamed West. The night was silent on the Hinson plantation, save for the faint hiss of cicadas in the trees and the distant rush of the Tennessee River. The world outside was consumed by war, but within the small workshop behind his home, Jack Hinson was building something far more personal. The glow of a lantern cast long, flickering shadows over wood shavings and iron filings as Jack bent over his workbench. His hands, calloused from years of farming and hunting, now trembled with a new purpose. He was no longer shaping tools for life. He was forging a weapon for vengeance. Jack had never been a gunsmith. He had been a farmer, a hunter, a man who prized the rhythm of planting and harvest, of soil beneath his nails and venison on his table. But grief has a way of transforming men. It strips away hesitation, reshapes them into something unrecognizable even to themselves. In the weeks since Union soldiers had executed his 2 sons, boys guilty of nothing more than being born in the wrong place at the wrong time, Jack's sorrow had fermented into a single, relentless obsession: retribution. He knew he couldn't take on the Union Army with brute force. He was 60 years old, his beard streaked with gray, his shoulders heavy with time. But he had patience. He had the cunning of a hunter. And he knew the woods and ridges along the Tennessee River better than any soldier ever would. What he needed was a weapon that could turn patience into power. The rifle began as an idea, a ghost that whispered to him in the nights when sleep refused to come. He pictured it in detail. A long barrel for accuracy, a heavy stock to steady his aim, and a scope that would let him see the whites of a man's eyes from half a mile away. He had hunted deer at distances that tested the skill of even the finest marksman. Why not men? With careful planning, Jack set about transforming the vision into steel and wood. The barrel was forged long, 41 inches, almost as long as a man's arm, polished to perfection until it gleamed like a blade. The length would give him accuracy unmatched by the standard-issue rifles carried by Union soldiers. Each piece of iron he handled, each strike of the hammer, seemed to echo the pounding of his heart. The stock was carved from walnut, the grain smooth and sturdy beneath his tools. As his knife shaved the wood into shape, Jack thought of his sons. He remembered how they had once sat at this very bench, watching him repair plows or whittle hunting knives. The memory stabbed deeper than the blade in his hand, and he paused, breath caught in his chest. For a moment the grief threatened to overwhelm him, but then his jaw tightened, and he carved with renewed fury, each cut a wordless vow: "This is for you, this is for justice." He worked mostly at night when the Union patrols were less likely to stumble upon his property. The lantern flame cast an amber glow on his face, highlighting eyes that were no longer the calm, steady gaze of a farmer, but the sharp, feverish stare of a man reborn in tragedy. The townsfolk would later whisper that Jack Hinson aged 10 years in those nights, his hair paling, his expression hardening like stone. The most difficult part was the scope. Precision optics were rare in the South, and Union blockades had made them even rarer. But Jack had friends, quiet men who despised the war as much as he did, who owed him favors from better times. Through hushed dealings and secret hands, a scope found its way into Jack's possession. He mounted it carefully onto the rifle, adjusting it with painstaking detail until he could see across the river as if it were only steps away. When at last the weapon was complete, Jack stood back and studied it. The rifle was beautiful in its own way, sleek, deadly, and precise. It was longer than most men could comfortably carry, and its weight would make it impractical in the hands of a soldier. But Jack was not a soldier. He was a hunter. This rifle was not meant for battlefields. It was meant for shadows, for ridges above the river, for the quiet patience of a man who could wait hours for the perfect shot. He ran his hand along the barrel, feeling the cool steel under his palm. It was as if the rifle breathed with him, its presence a strange comfort in the silence. He whispered to it as though it were alive, as though his son's spirits had seeped into the walnut stock and polished steel. "We'll make them pay. he murmured, his voice breaking the stillness of the night. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, carrying the faint sounds of marching boots somewhere far down the river. The Union was always moving, always pressing deeper into Tennessee. They believed themselves untouchable, armed with numbers and cannons, with fleets patrolling the waters. But Jack knew better. Numbers meant nothing against a man who could kill from half a mile away and vanish before they knew where the shot had come from. Before dawn, he carried the rifle outside. The mist clung to the ground, shrouding the fields in pale gray. Jack knelt and placed the butt of the gun against his shoulder, peering through the scope at a distant fence post. He inhaled deeply, steadying his breath the way he had done countless times in deer hunts. His finger squeezed the trigger. The explosion shattered the quiet, sending a flock of birds screaming into the sky. When the smoke cleared, the fence post stood with a hole clean through its center. Jack lowered the rifle slowly. His lips pressed into a thin line, not of triumph, but of grim resolve. The weapon worked exactly as he had envisioned. It was no longer just a rifle. It was an extension of his will, an instrument of his vengeance, a voice for two sons silenced too soon. From that day forward, the Hinson farm was no longer a sanctuary of crops and family. It became a fortress of solitude, a place where a grieving father sharpened his sorrow into steel. The man who once sought only peace had taken his first step into war, a war of one against many, a silent war fought from the shadows of the Tennessee hills. The rifle rested against the wall of his workshop, gleaming in the dim light. Jack looked at it one last time before blowing out the lantern. His grief had been given form. His oath had been armed, and the river would soon carry the echo of its first shot. The Tennessee River glistened beneath the morning sun, its surface broken by the steady churn of Union gunboats. Smoke curled from their stacks, drifting lazily into the crisp autumn air. To most men in Stewart County, the sight of those ironclad vessels was enough to spark fear, a reminder that the Union's grip was tightening with every passing day. But to Jack Hinson, watching from the ridge above, the river was no longer a symbol of power. It was a hunting ground. He lay prone among the rocks, his new rifle resting steady across a patch of moss. The long barrel extended past his shoulder, aimed toward the water where the boats cut their slow, commanding path. Through the scope, the world narrowed into a perfect circle of clarity. Jack could see the sailors moving about the decks, laughing, talking, unaware of the eyes that followed their every step. For hours, Jack waited. The patience of a hunter was second nature to him. He knew the rhythm of the river, the way shadows shifted as the sun climbed, the moment when soldiers grew careless after long patrols. His breathing slowed until it matched the quiet rise and fall of the earth beneath him. The rifle felt alive against his cheek, as though it, too, hungered for the moment. Finally, opportunity came. On the deck of the lead gunboat, an officer emerged, tall, uniform crisp, a saber gleaming at his hip. Through the scope, Jack could see the man's posture, the arrogance in the way he gestured to his crew. This was no faceless enemy. This was a man who believed he owned the river, who believed Tennessee had already bowed to Union might. Jack's jaw tightened. He thought of his sons, dragged from their home and executed without mercy. He inhaled. The world fell silent. The shot cracked like thunder, rolling across the hills. Birds erupted from the trees. On the river below, chaos broke out. The officer collapsed where he stood, his body crumpling against the deck. Shouts rang out, sailors scrambling for cover, but they had no idea where the shot had come from. Jack had already melted into the trees, moving with the fluid grace of a man who had hunted this land his entire life. By the time the Union gunboats unleashed a barrage of cannon fire at the ridgeline, Jack was gone. The shells shattered trees and tore into the earth, but they hit nothing but shadows. The river carried their fury downstream, leaving only silence in its wake. That night, Union officers gathered in anger and disbelief. One man, armed with a single rifle, had struck them from a distance they could hardly comprehend. They called it luck at first, a blind shot. But when the killings continued, when officers began falling one by one, always at long range, always without warning, they realized it was no accident. Someone was hunting them. For Jack, the first kill was not triumph. It was justice, raw and bitter. As he sat alone in his cabin, the rifle resting against the wall, he felt no joy. His hands trembled slightly as he poured a drink of whiskey, the echo of the gunshot still ringing in his ears. The officer's face lingered in his mind, frozen in that final moment of surprise and fear. Jack whispered into the silence, "That was for you, boys." But vengeance, once tasted, is never sated. The days that followed turned into a grim ritual. Jack would vanish into the hills before dawn, rifle strapped across his back. He learned to choose his ground carefully. High ridges with clear sight lines, thickets that offered cover, hollows where he could slip away unseen. The Union patrols became his prey. He studied their movements, their routines, their weaknesses. When the moment came, the rifle spoke, and another officer fell. Fear spread quickly through the Union ranks. Soldiers who once marched boldly now crouched nervously on the decks of their boats. Officers who once strutted in defiance now ducked at shadows, their confidence shattered by an unseen marksman who struck without warning. The name Hinson was whispered with growing dread, though few dared to speak it aloud. Each shot carved Jack deeper into legend. Locals began to speak of him as a ghost, a figure who could appear anywhere along the river, strike with deadly precision and vanish before pursuit could begin. To the Union, he was a menace. To his neighbors, he was justice embodied. Yet behind the legend, Jack remained a grieving father. At night, the cabin was too quiet. The chairs his sons once filled sat empty by the fire. Sometimes he would hear their laughter in his dreams, only to wake with tears in his eyes and the weight of silence pressing on his chest. The rifle was his only companion now, the cold steel a reminder of the oath he had sworn. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Jack returned from another day of silent war. He cleaned the rifle with steady hands, oiling the barrel, checking the scope as if preparing it for the next hunt. Outside, the river rolled on, indifferent to the lives it carried, indifferent to the blood it swallowed. Jack paused, staring into the glow of the lantern. The war was far from over. His vengeance had only begun. The Union thought their might came from numbers, from cannons, from iron and steel. Jack Hinson had shown them another kind of power, the power of one man, armed with patience, skill, and an unbreakable will. The river was no longer theirs to command. It was his hunting ground now, and every shot was a reminder that justice still lingered in the hills of Tennessee. And so, with the first blood drawn on the Tennessee River, the legend of the Civil War's deadliest sniper was born. The news traveled faster than the river current itself. By the time the Union command in Tennessee received word, it was no longer just a single officer struck down. It was a pattern, a phantom stalking the waterway. Whispers of the farmer with the long rifle spread through taverns, farmhouses, and camps. Some called him a vigilante. Others called him a ghost. The Union soldiers, however, had a different word for him: nightmare. Every morning, the Tennessee River carried ironclads and transports past Stewart County. Once, those boats had been symbols of dominance, their decks filled with confident men who believed they were untouchable. But now, each voyage felt like a death march. The men stood straighter, moved quicker, and glanced over their shoulders as if death itself crouched on the ridges. The rifle changed everything. Jack U.S. weapon, custom-made with a long barrel and a scope reaching nearly a mile, was unlike anything most soldiers had seen. They were used to muskets and short-range fire, where volleys rang out like rolling thunder across a battlefield. But Jack struck from distances they could scarcely fathom. To them, it seemed as though the hills themselves had turned hostile. Jack never lingered on the tales being told. For him, each shot was not about glory but about keeping his oath alive. Still, he could not ignore the shifting air around him. When he walked into Dover to buy supplies, locals lowered their voices and nodded in quiet respect. They knew who he was, though few dared to say his name openly. Children whispered of the man with the ghost gun, while mothers lit candles praying he would not bring Union wrath down upon their doorsteps. One evening, after a particularly sharp strike that left another officer dead on a gunboat deck, Jack stopped at the edge of his land and looked out over the river. The sunset turned the water into molten fire, streaks of red and gold shimmering across the surface. For the first time, he felt the weight of what he was becoming. He was no longer just a grieving father or a wronged farmer. He was something larger, an idea, a story carried on every tongue. But legend carried danger. Union commanders soon ordered reprisals. Patrols swept through the countryside, searching for the sniper. Farms were raided, barns burned, and innocent men dragged into camps for questioning. Some of Jack's neighbors cursed his name in fear, while others swore loyalty and kept silent. The war had already divided Tennessee, but now Jack's solitary campaign carved the split deeper. One night, as Jack cleaned his rifle by lantern light, his wife Mary placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "Jack," she whispered, her voice heavy with worry, "how long can you go on like this? Every day they get closer. Every day they punish people who had nothing to do with you." Jack set the rifle aside and looked into her tired eyes. The grief there mirrored his own, but beneath it burned the same unyielding resolve. "I swore to our boys," he said softly. "I can't stop now, not until they've paid for what they did." Mary nodded, tears shining in the dim light. She understood, though the cost was written across her face. As the weeks turned to months, Jack honed his craft. He studied the river like a chessboard, predicting where the Union would move next. He chose his targets with precision. Always officers, always men who gave the orders. Each shot was not just vengeance but strategy, weakening morale and shaking the command structure. Stories of his accuracy grew wilder with each retelling. Some claimed he could shoot a coin from half a mile away. Others swore he never missed a shot. The truth was close enough. Jack had spent his life hunting in these hills, and the rifle became an extension of himself. The trigger responded to his heartbeat. The scope aligned with his will. When he squeezed the shot, it was as if the earth itself whispered in his ear, guiding the bullet home. Union retaliation grew desperate. Gunboats fired blindly into the ridges, their cannons shattering trees and sending flocks of birds screaming into the sky. Soldiers marched miles inland, only to return empty-handed. Jack always vanished before they arrived, leaving behind nothing but broken branches and the lingering echo of his shots. It wasn't long before Jack's legend crossed state lines. Confederate soldiers, weary from their own battles, spoke in awe of the Tennessee farmer who had declared his own war. Some romanticized him as a hero of the South, though Jack never fought for flags or governments. His war was personal, carved into the graves of his sons. One bitter winter morning, frost coating the earth like shards of glass, Jack settled into position on a ridge overlooking a supply boat. His breath clouded in the cold air as he steadied the rifle. Through the scope he saw not just an officer, but a man laughing, sipping coffee, oblivious to the world beyond his deck. Jack hesitated for the briefest moment. That laughter, it reminded him of the boys. For the first time, his finger faltered on the trigger. Then he remembered the rope burns on his sons' necks, the way their bodies had been discarded like animals. The hesitation vanished. The shot rang out, sharp and final. Another man fell. Another warning was delivered. That night, alone by the fire, Jack allowed himself a rare smile. The Union might command armies, fleets, and cannons, but they could not command fear. Fear belonged to him now, and as the Tennessee River rolled on, dark and endless, so too did the legend of Jack Hinson, the farmer turned phantom, the man who refused to be broken. The river was no longer just a lifeline of commerce and war, It had become a corridor of dread. Every bend, every bluff, every shadowed ridge whispered of the man they could not catch. Soldiers of the Union now refused to linger on deck without glancing toward the tree line. At night, the officers ordered lanterns extinguished, hoping to disappear into darkness, as if the absence of light might hide them from the eyes that always seemed to be watching. Jack Hinson had become that shadow. By the winter of 1863, he had mastered the rhythm of the river. He knew the timetables of the transports, the favorite mooring points of the ironclads, the careless habits of their officers. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was war, one man against an empire. He chose his positions with a hunter's instinct, blending into cedar thickets and limestone outcroppings. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the sound of wind rattling through the bare branches. Then came the single crack of his rifle, a sound that echoed across the water like a death knell. Each shot carved deeper into Union morale, but it also carved deeper into Jack's soul. Killing, even in vengeance, left its mark. When he returned home at night, the quiet of his cabin pressed down on him. Mary would wait by the fire, her face pale, her hands red from work. She said little, but her eyes asked questions her lips could not. How many today? How much longer? Jack had no answers. Only the memory of 2 sons, their laughter stolen, their lives cut short. Yet the war around him did not pause. The Union, enraged by their inability to silence the phantom, turned their wrath upon Stewart County. Families awoke to find barns in flames, fields trampled, livestock driven away. Soldiers accused civilians of harboring the sniper, dragging men from their homes, beating confessions from lips that had nothing to confess. Fear became the air the county breathed. Neighbors began to whisper not just in awe, but in dread. "They took my boy last week," Samuel said, voice low and hoarse. "Said he was helping you. He wasn't, Jack. He was just a boy." Jack's jaw tightened. "I never asked for help," he replied. Samuel's hands trembled as he gripped his hat. "Doesn't matter. They think we all help you. They'll keep taking more until there's nothing left. You're killing us one by one, same as you're killing them." The words struck Jack harder than any musket ball. For a moment he felt the weight of what he had unleashed. Not just vengeance, but a storm sweeping through innocent lives. Yet, when he thought of his sons, of their broken bodies hanging as a warning, the fire in him reignited. "I didn't start this war, Samuel," he said quietly, "but I won't let them finish it on my land." Samuel left without another word, and Jack returned to the silence of the hills. Despite the growing cost, Jack's campaign spread like wildfire through rumor and song. Confederate sympathizers painted him as a lone avenger, a living embodiment of Southern resistance. Union soldiers cursed him as a demon who struck without warning. To Jack himself, he was neither. He was simply a father keeping a promise. One frosty dawn, he tracked a Union gunboat moving upriver. From his perch high on the bluff, he studied the deck through his scope. Officers paced nervously, their collars pulled tight against the cold. Then he saw it. A young lieutenant, no older than his sons had been, barking orders with an arrogance that made Jack's blood run hot. He steadied his breath, pressed his cheek to the stock, and felt the world narrow to the single heartbeat between life and death. The rifle cracked. The lieutenant dropped, his body twisting like a rag doll. Chaos erupted on deck, men diving for cover, cannons firing blindly into the hills. Jack slipped away before the smoke cleared, leaving nothing behind but the legend of his unseen hand. That night, as he sat by the fire, Mary broke her silence. "Jack," she whispered, "you're not the man you once were. They've taken our boys, yes, but what are they taking from you?" Jack stared into the flames, the crackle and pop filling the room. He had no answer. Vengeance was all he had left, and even that was beginning to consume him. Still, when dawn came, he shouldered the rifle again. The oath he had sworn over his sons' graves could not be broken. As long as the Union ships haunted the river, so too would his shadow. And so the legend grew darker, sharper, heavier. Jack Hinson was no longer just a grieving father. He was vengeance itself, carved into the bluffs of Tennessee, whispered in the barracks of Union soldiers, etched into the fears of an army that could not silence a single man. The Tennessee hills stood cold and silent, their ridgelines etched black against the winter sky. To the Union soldiers patrolling the Cumberland River, every rock, every hollow log, every tangle of brush seemed to conceal the eyes of a ghost. They had come to fear the land itself, for it was Jack Hinson's land now, and he had bent it to his war. By the spring of 1864, Jack had become more than a rumor. His name carried weight, whispered in taverns, muttered in Union camps, spoken with reverence by Southerners who longed for justice. He was the farmer who had lost 2 sons, the man who refused to surrender, the sniper whose bullet found its mark from impossible distances. But above all, he was the oath personified, a father who had sworn vengeance and had not rested since. Each kill was precise, deliberate. Jack did not waste powder on ordinary soldiers. His scope sought out officers, pilots, engineers, the men who commanded and steered. He had learned that to break the spine of an army, one must cut off its head, and so, boat after boat crept downriver with fewer leaders than it had begun with, while whispers of the phantom sniper turned fear into paralysis. Union command launched manhunts. Patrols swept the forests. Dogs sniffed the ground. Cavalry combed the bluffs. Yet Jack always vanished, slipping into ravines and caves known only to those born of the land. He carried no uniform, bore no flag. His rifle was his allegiance, and his oath was his commander. But revenge, like fire, consumes more than it warms. Each night Jack returned to his cabin worn thin, his face etched by shadows deeper than age. Mary, steadfast but weary, often found him staring at the empty chairs where their sons once sat. She wanted to beg him to stop, to let the war rage on without him, but she knew the futility of words against an oath carved in grief. One night, as the cicadas hummed outside and the fire crackled low, Jack spoke the truth that weighed on him. "Mary," he said, voice raw, "I thought this would ease the pain. Thought each shot would bring me closer to peace. But the further I go, the more I see their faces. Not just ours. The boys on those boats, their sons, too." Mary reached for his hand, her fingers calloused from work, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "Then why keep going?" she asked softly. Jack closed his eyes, and in the silence that followed, the weight of his vow pressed against him. "Because I swore it over their graves, and a father who breaks his word is no father at all." The war raged on, and with it Jack's solitary campaign. His rifle became legend, his shadow etched into Union nightmares. By some accounts his tally reached 100 men, perhaps more. Others swore it was far greater, impossible to count. The truth lay buried in the hills, known only to Jack and the God who watched from above. Yet what cannot be denied is this: the Union never captured him. They scoured Tennessee, burned homes, and terrorized neighbors, but Jack remained untouchable. Even as gray gave way to blue, even as the Confederacy fell, the man who never chose sides carved his own war, a silent war waged with grief and iron. When peace finally crept back to the land, Jack laid his rifle aside. He had fulfilled his oath, though whether it brought him peace or only emptiness, none could say. He returned to the soil, to the life of a farmer, his vengeance etched forever into the bluffs that once echoed with gunfire. And so ended the second chapter of Jack Hinson's story. Not with surrender, not with capture, but with the haunting silence of a man who kept his word, no matter the cost. His tale is not just about death, but about the unbearable weight of loss, about how grief can twist a man into both legend and shadow. It is a reminder that the Civil War was not only fought in fields and fortresses, but in the hearts of fathers and mothers whose lives were torn apart. Jack Hinson never asked for war, but when it came to his doorstep, he vowed to fight it on his own terms, and in doing so, became one of the most feared and mysterious figures of the American frontier. If you want to hear the next chapter of Jack Hinson's Untold Saga, how a grieving farmer became the deadliest sniper of the Civil War, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell and join us as we uncover the hidden stories history books leave behind. The legend continues in Episode 3. Don't miss it.